Hey y'all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a quick look at a mini PC from Acemagic called the Vista V1, and it seems to be the #1 best-selling mini PC on Amazon at this point in time. Kind of interesting because it is very cost-effective. You can find it for only around $160, packing in 16 gigabytes of RAM, 512 gigabytes of SSD, not to mention coupon codes that can bring the cost down even lower. So it's around $150 all in for a compact Windows desktop, and I think that low price is probably why they've been selling so well, but let's take a closer look and discover if it's any good in this video. Now, to hit that budget price, the processor here definitely isn't anything cutting edge. In fact, it's the Intel Celeron N97. That being said, Celeron chips have definitely come a long way. 10 years ago, they were quite slow and sluggish, and these days, it's still not going to be lightning fast, but for basic computing needs, things like document editing, email, and web browsing, it's also gotten significantly better. We'll discuss that more later in this video. It still is using integrated Intel UHD graphics though, so it's not designed for serious gaming. If you're doing some retro emulation though, it might still be okay. And the RAM as well as SSD here can actually be accessed behind the back cover of the mini PC if you wanted to upgrade these components, including the SSD up to 2 TBs in the future, which is good. As well as being super compact, it can even be mounted behind a TV, for example, and kind of disappear from view. Also, maybe kind of inspired by an Apple Mac Mini in terms of the shell design, but it is built out of plastic instead of metal, of course. And in terms of the networking, it is using Bluetooth 4.2. Kind of wish that this spec would have been bumped to at least Bluetooth 5. So it is one corner that was slightly cut here. And this model does have an active fan that should hopefully prevent against overheating, although it's not a silent mini PC. Now, we've checked out a couple of other computers from Ace PC or Acemagic formerly in the past, and they've been centered more around gaming. Some of their models packing higher end Ryzen processors and dedicated GPUs as well, but obviously this is more of an entry-level model from them. Definitely not as ambitious in terms of the performance as well as design, but a lot more cost-effective for general computing. The box though is completely cardboard and a little janky. There's no other kind of logos that are stamped on it, although we have just a quick user guide and then the mini PC, which is indeed super small. At least the cardboard here makes it more eco-friendly and easier to recycle afterwards. You'll be greeted with a power adapter that's using a barrel plug connection. Would have preferred to see USB Type-C instead, which is going to be more universal, but it is what it is. And we also have a bundled HDMI cable supporting 4K video output on monitors and TVs, plus a mounting bracket and screws, again if you want to pop it behind a TV. Again, the design of this particular shell definitely gives me some Apple vibes, but still looks relatively clean. Interestingly, there's a sticker on top that tells us for faster setup, you can bypass internet connection, otherwise there might be some Windows updates during the initial setup flow if you want to more quickly get into the UI the initial time. Here's the ventilation for the fan, and on the top here we have just two full-size USB 3.0 ports, 3.5mm headphone jack, a dedicated power key, more ventilation. Then on the back we have the remaining I/O, including two more USB 2.0 ports, full size. That's going to be the power adapter port, and then we have a full-size HDMI plus a display port. So you can connect to two monitors simultaneously there if you're not using additional adapters, and the wired Ethernet port. Finally, at the bottom here, we have some of the mounting adapters plus some soft touch feet that prevents it from sliding around onto a surface or a desk. So aside from mini PC sticks that reminds me of kind of a thumb drive, this is still going to be one of the smaller chassis or shells that I've seen. Here it is next to an average sized phone for reference, around 6.5 inches. It almost disappears behind it. So as far as being a full-blown Windows computer, it still is relatively impressive in terms of how small this thing is. And despite the plastic shell, it doesn't feel too hollow or cheap, has a okay density to it. Startup time is relatively quick, taking under 20 seconds to get into Windows from a cold boot, and we can verify that indeed we have 16 gigabytes of RAM running on the N97. It is a fully activated and licensed version of Windows 64-bit. And for the built-in SSD, we have roughly 431 gigabytes remaining out of the box, And general system navigation also seems to be doing all right. It's not going to be instantaneous compared to on even faster computers. Some of the animations may have a split-second delay, but it still is a usable experience. Now, when it comes to reception strength, the Wi-Fi signal seems to be actually pretty solid, even though we are a little bit further away from a router located on a different level of this building. I'm still seeing pretty strong reception, and overall loading speeds when it comes to web browsing still seems to be respectable. Coupled with the 16 gigabytes of RAM means you'll be able to open up more tabs in the background without things reloading or crashing. Over a dozen tabs in Edge as well as Chrome, and both worked just fine, which is a benefit compared to previous budget mini PCs. Sometimes came with just 4 or 8 gigabytes of RAM more commonly at this price point. So this is actually pretty neat to see. So again, if you're just reading back articles, doing some light research, the N97 is actually keeping up pretty well. And the fan in here is actually relatively quiet, even when it is popping up, such as in this current state, putting it closer here to the microphone. It still is a relatively quiet white noise, I would say under 20 decibels, so it's not going to be too distracting, and really it's only when you open up a couple more programs in the background that you start to, again, hear that a little bit, only kicking on when it's necessary. Now, taking a quick look at passmark scores, even though synthetic benchmarks don't necessarily always correlate one-to-one with real-world performance, it gives us a rough snapshot of what the compute power is capable of. So this is a quad-core processor, relatively energy efficient, and reaches a little bit north of 5,600 on Passmark. Just to serve as reference, one of the most popular Celeron chips in a similar class, just a couple of years back, was the N3450, which by comparison was around 2,000 on Passmark. And if you're looking at older gen processors than this, for example some i3s and i5s from a couple of generations past, surprisingly the benchmark scores are at a similar level. So again, these entry-level chips have definitely come a long way, even though it isn't a powerhouse by 2025 standards versus the equivalent newest flagship chips. However, if you are comparing them with slightly older generation processors, it actually stacks up surprisingly close to more of a mid-range performer. Although as reference, we can also see the Apple M1 chip scoring a little north of 14,000. Point being, this processor is actually no longer that bad when it comes to just navigating around, doesn't feel overly slow or sluggish. Which, speaking of office-related programs, whether it's Word, Excel, PowerPoint, can also be handled by the N97 here really without any problems, whether for school, work, or personal use, and it still seems to be doing all right here. In fact, we open up the Task Manager, we can see that currently, despite having a couple of programs running there, the Windows 11 operating system is using approximately 35% of the system's RAM. Also, a quick test of video streaming using YouTube. Let's also pull this into, for example, 1080p to begin with, as well as stats for nerds. We can see that the video is relatively smooth to play, and it shouldn't offer too many issues in this mode. You don't have to be waiting too long with relatively minimal dropped frames there at the very top. Let's also try scrubbing ahead to maybe a different point in the video and see how it fares. Just a split-second delay there, but overall, definitely not bad. And then the video continues to play back. So for media streaming in general, whether it's from Netflix or even local files that you're opening up and viewing back, it's not going to be that problematic if you connect this to a TV, for instance. Let's also try cranking up the resolution here to 4K. Now, it may take a split second longer to buffer initially, but also surprisingly not that bad. We can still see just a couple of drop frames initially, but once the video begins to play back, it still is a relatively smooth experience. So even on entry-level computers these days, the Celeron chips have gotten good enough, thankfully, to handle video streaming, even in 4K or Ultra HD resolution, generally without too many complaints. Some basic gaming. For example, Fortnite still seems to be doing alright, as you can see here in this demo, actually approaching 60 FPS, and in other titles like Dota 2 here, you'll average around 30 to 40 FPS, but it still seems to be mostly playable, though this is at one of the lower graphic settings. Furthermore, if you're using this for emulation, it can be an even smoother experience, looking at older classic titles from systems like PlayStation, as well as PSP, GameCube, even Nintendo DS titles can all be played surprisingly quite well on hardware like this, or perhaps not too surprisingly, because those consoles of yesteryear didn't have as much horsepower as modern day computers, which is why for emulation, looking at those older titles, even systems like this can do a surprisingly pretty decent job. Again, a benefit of a full Windows computer is you can install millions of apps. Anything really that's compatible with x86 Intel computers will be fully functioning here, but maybe one advantage versus similar budget computers running on Chrome OS might be a little bit more restrained, even though Chrome OS is also improving and does have mobile Android app support, but as a OG legacy desktop operating system on here, you can find essentially any program. Even for more niche software, support here will likely be a little more exhaustive. So in recap, having reasonable expectations, I think you'll still be mostly content with the performance on here for honestly 80-85% of folks out there, unless you're looking at more intensive gaming. AAA style games, especially if you crank up some of the graphic settings, obviously won't be suitable for a system like this, but you can also explore options like cloud gaming, including xCloud from Xbox, as well as Amazon's Luna, and this will just act as a portal as long as you have a fast enough Wi-Fi connection, which thankfully the reception strength here seems to be pretty good. Also, it's not going to be great for video editing. Yes, you can splice together a couple of clips, especially if you're working with only 1080p resolution files. It's surprisingly still manageable. For example, exporting a 5-minute clip will take roughly 5 minutes or so, but if you start working with higher resolution 4K files, editing those, the processing time and rendering will be significantly slower with the integrated graphics. Although for things like Photoshop, just some image touch-ups, it can still be done on a machine like this. So that's more or less it as far as our quick hands-on review of the Acemagic Vista V1. Again, this mini PC isn't anything mind-blowing or revolutionary. In fact, we have seen other Celeron and even N97 powered laptops in the past couple of months as well. But the general takeaway is for a around $150 price tag, it's nice to see that 16 gigabytes of RAM is becoming increasingly easier to find on newer computers. And that extra RAM does help the system feel a little bit more snappy if you are doing a bit more multitasking, especially as updates become more resource intensive. It helps it be just a little bit more future proof. And once again, entry-level computers have come a long way compared to the days of netbooks, so that you can actually use this for basic computing work. It actually felt surprisingly responsive. So as long as you have reasonable expectations, it's actually not a bad showing for this entry-level price. So yeah, I can kind of understand why this is a pretty popular choice when shopping on Amazon at this point in time. Of course, you can find more powerful machines, and obviously if you're expecting performance to rival a Apple Mac Mini that's packing an M1 or M3 chip, then of course you'll be disappointed. For things like video editing and gaming, it's really not designed for that. But for, again, lightweight computing tasks, coupled with the 16 gigs of RAM, makes it a surprisingly usable experience, I would say, at least more so than I was initially expecting. You can check out more details in the links down below if you are interested. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been just a quick look at the very popular Acemagic Vista V1 budget mini PC.